It is March 17, 1892. The ground in Exeter, Rhode Island, is frozen solid. A bitter wind howls through the graveyard of the Chestnut Hill Baptist Church. A small group of men stands huddled around an open pit, their breath visible in the cold air. Among them is a man named George Brown. He is not a superstitious peasant from the Dark Ages. He is a respected farmer, a modern American citizen living in a time of railroads and electricity. But on this day, George Brown is doing something that belongs in a nightmare. He is watching the village doctor dig up the bodies of his own family. They first unearth his wife, Mary. She has been dead for nearly a decade. Her body is little more than a skeleton, crumbling into dust. Next, they dig up his oldest daughter, Mary Olive. She, too, is decomposed, nothing but bones and grave clothes. But then, they turn their shovels to the grave of his 19-year-old daughter. Her name is Mercy. She has been in the frozen ground for 2 months. When they pry the lid off her coffin, the men recoil in horror. Mercy Brown does not look dead. She has shifted position in the box. Her skin is not skeletal or decayed, it looks fresh. And most terrifying of all, there is liquid blood in her heart and around her mouth. To the doctor present, this is just the result of the freezing winter preserving the body. But to George Brown and the terrified neighbors standing behind him, it is proof of something else entirely. It is proof that Mercy is not resting in peace. It is proof that she is leaving her grave at night to feed on the living. They believe she is a vampire, and to stop her, they know exactly what they have to do. They cut open her chest, they remove her heart and her liver. And right there in the graveyard, on a jagged rock, they burn her organs to ash. This sounds like a scene from a gothic horror novel. But this was a horrifying reality for hundreds of families across New England. This phenomenon is known to historians as the Great New England Vampire Panic. For over a century, while the rest of the world was marching toward the modern era, the quiet rural towns of Connecticut, Rhode Island, and Vermont were gripped by a shadow. It was a time when neighbors looked at neighbors with suspicion, when grief was replaced by paranoia, and when the cure for a mysterious illness was found in the desecration of the dead. To understand why a father would burn his own daughter's heart, we have to understand the monster they were fighting. They didn't call it a vampire at first. They didn't have the Hollywood image of Dracula with a cape and fangs. To them, the monster was invisible. They called it consumption. Today, we know this disease as tuberculosis. But in the 18th and 19th centuries, tuberculosis was not just a sickness. It was the leading cause of death in the eastern United States. It killed roughly 25% of the entire population. Imagine walking down the street and knowing that 1 out of every 4 people you saw would die from this single cause. But it wasn't just the scale of the death that was terrifying. It was the way it killed you. Consumption was slow. It was agonizingly, brutally slow. A person could be sick for years, fading away by inches. The bacterial infection attacks the lungs, literally eating the tissue from the inside out. The symptoms were harrowing to watch. The victim would lose their appetite and waste away until they were skeletal. Their skin would turn a pale, ghostly white. Their eyes would become wide and glassy, sunken deep into their skulls. They would suffer from night sweats that soaked their sheets. And most vividly, they would cough up blood. Bright, red, arterial blood. To a pre-scientific community, this didn't look like a germ. It looked like something was draining the life out of the victim. It looked like a predation. But the true horror of consumption was how it traveled. It is a highly contagious respiratory disease. It spreads most easily among people living in close quarters. So, naturally, it decimated families. It would start with one person. Maybe the father would get sick and die. Then, a few weeks or months later, the wife would start to look pale. She would lose weight. She would start coughing blood. Then the eldest son, then the youngest daughter. One by one, the family would wither away, as if a curse was moving down the bloodline. For the people of New England, this pattern was impossible to ignore. They watched a healthy family member die, and immediately afterward, another family member would begin to fade. It felt like the first victim was not truly gone. It felt like the dead were reaching back from the grave to pull their relatives down with them. And in the isolated farming communities of Rhode Island, this belief evolved into a specific folklore. They believed that the dead person was feeding on the vital force of the living. They believed the connection between family members was a psychic link that death could not break. The corpse in the coffin was dead, yes, but some unholy hunger remained. And because the victim was losing blood, coughing it up in violent fits, the logic followed that the blood must be going somewhere. It was going to the corpse. This belief system created a terrifying loop of logic. If your brother is dying of consumption, it is because your recently deceased uncle is feeding on him. Therefore, to save your brother, you must kill the uncle. Again, this is where the folklore of the New England vampire diverges from the movies. These vampires were not aristocratic counts living in castles. They were not seductive. They were tragic, mindless parasites. They didn't even leave their graves physically. The belief was that their spirit, or their astral body, would wander at night, invisible, to drain the life from their kin. But the physical body in the grave was the battery powering this spirit. So, to break the connection, you had to destroy the physical link. You had to exhume the body. This was not a decision taken lightly. These were deeply religious, God-fearing people. The sanctity of the grave was paramount, but fear is a powerful motivator. When a mother watched her last surviving child start to cough that dry, hacking cough, she would do anything to save them. The ritual of exhumation was practically a medical procedure in their eyes. It was performed in broad daylight. It was often done with the approval of the town elders or even the local clergy. They would dig up the suspected vampire and examine the body for signs of life. And this is where biology played a cruel trick on them. Decomposition is not a uniform process. It depends on the temperature, the soil, and the cause of death. Sometimes, a body decomposes rapidly. But sometimes, especially in the cold New England winter, a body is preserved. Furthermore, the natural process of decomposition can look suspiciously like life to an untrained eye. As a body decays, the skin shrinks and pulls back. This can make the hair and nails appear to have grown longer. The gums recede, making the teeth look longer and more predatory. Gas builds up inside the torso, bloating the stomach. To a terrified farmer, this doesn't look like bloating. It looks like the corpse is well fed. It looks like the dead person has been eating. And then there is the blood. As the internal organs break down, a dark, reddish liquid can accumulate in the lungs. If the body is moved or jostled, this liquid can be forced up through the throat and out of the mouth. This is called purge fluid, but to the people of Exeter or Jewett City, this was fresh blood. It was the blood of their dying relatives, stolen and stored in the corpse of the monster. Finding liquid blood in the heart or mouth was the smoking gun. It was the confirmation that the corpse was a vampire. And once that confirmation was made, the therapeutic desecration began. The most common method was to remove the heart. The heart was seen as the seat of the blood and the center of the vital force. If the heart contained liquid blood, it was cut out. Sometimes it was simply burned on a rock nearby. Other times, the ritual was even more desperate. In a grim attempt to use the hair of the dog logic, the ashes of the burned heart would sometimes be collected. They would be mixed with water or medicine, and this mixture would be fed to the sick relative. Think about the psychological horror of that moment. A dying child, weak and terrified, being fed the ashes of their own mother's heart by a father who is trying to save them. It was a cannibalistic communion born of absolute despair. One of the most famous early cases occurred in Jewett City, Connecticut, in 1854. The Ray family had been devastated by consumption. Over a period of several years, the father and 3 sons died. Then, the second son, Henry, fell ill. The surviving family members were panicked. They were convinced that the dead brothers were feeding on Henry. So, on a quiet afternoon, a group of men went to the cemetery. They dug up the bodies of the 2 brothers who had died most recently. They burned them right there in the graveyard. But it didn't work. Henry died anyway. You would think that the failure of the ritual would stop the practice. You would think they would realize that burning bodies didn't cure the sickness. But superstition is immune to failure. If the patient died, it wasn't because the ritual was fake. It was because they had acted too late. It was because they hadn't burned the right organ. Or it was because there was another vampire they hadn't found yet. The panic was self-sustaining. Every death was proof of the curse. And every exhumation that revealed a preserved body was proof of the cause. And this brings us back to the Brown family in Exeter. The case of Mercy Brown is significant not just because of the gruesome details. It is significant because of when it happened. This was late. By 1892, Robert Koch had already discovered the tuberculosis bacterium. Germ theory was being taught in medical schools. Doctors knew that diseases were caused by microscopic organisms, not by the spirits of the dead. The world was moving into the age of science. But in the isolated corners of New England, the old fears ran deep. When George Brown gave permission to exhume his family, he was standing on the fault line between two worlds. On one side was the modern doctor, telling him it was a disease of the lungs. On the other side were his neighbors, telling him it was a demon in the grave. And when you are watching your children die, science can feel very cold, and folklore can feel like the only action you can take. The doctor present at the exhumation, Dr. Harold Metcalf, tried to be the voice of reason. He explicitly told the crowd that Mercy's preserved state was due to the freezing cold. He told them the liquid blood was just a result of decomposition. He tried to explain the science. But the crowd ignored him. They saw what they wanted to see. They saw the rosiness in her cheeks. They saw the blood in her mouth. And they demanded the ritual. Dr. Metcalf, perhaps realizing he was outnumbered, or perhaps simply wanting to comfort a grieving father, stepped back. He allowed them to remove the heart. He watched as they burned it. And he watched as they mixed the ashes into a tonic for Mercy's sick brother, Edwin. Edwin drank it. He drank the remains of his sister to stop the consumption from eating him alive. But the tragedy of the vampire panic is that the monster was never in the grave. The monster was in the air they breathed, and no amount of fire could kill it. Edwin Brown died 2 months later. The ashes of his sister's heart did nothing to stop the bacteria destroying his lungs. He was buried in the same plot as Mercy, his body joining the row of tragic victims that now filled the family homestead. The ritual had failed, just as it had failed for the Ray family and the dozens of others who had tried it before. But the story of Mercy Brown did not stay buried in the frozen ground of Rhode Island. It traveled. Newspapers across the country picked up the sensational story of the Exeter vampire. Journalists from Boston and New York descended on the quiet village, mocking the locals for their backward superstitions. And one of those newspaper clippings made it all the way across the Atlantic Ocean. It landed on the desk of a theater manager and part-time writer in London. His name was Bram Stoker. At the time, Stoker was working on a novel about a blood-sucking aristocrat from Transylvania. Historians and literary scholars have found notes in Stoker's journals referring to the New England vampire cases. There is a striking resemblance between Mercy Brown, the 19-year-old girl who wastes away and then feeds on the living, and the character of Lucy Westenra in the novel Dracula. It is a strange twist of fate, a tragic farm girl from Rhode Island, who was simply a victim of a terrible disease, helped inspire the most famous monster in fiction history. Mercy Brown became a legend, but not the kind she deserved. She wasn't a monster. She was just a teenager who died too young. The New England vampire panic eventually faded away as the 20th century dawned. It wasn't defeated by steaks or garlic, it was defeated by education. As the germ theory of disease became common knowledge, people finally understood the true enemy. They learned that tuberculosis was spread by coughing and sneezing, not by spectral connections. They learned that isolation and sanitation were the cure, not exhumation and desecration. Furthermore, the practice of embalming became standard. Bodies were no longer left to decompose naturally, they were chemically preserved. This meant they no longer bloated or retained liquid blood in the same way, removing the visual proof that fueled the panic. The vampires disappeared because the shadows where they hid were illuminated by science. But looking back at this dark chapter, it is easy for us to judge. It is easy to look at George Brown and call him a ghoul for cutting out his daughter's heart. But we have to remember the context. These were people watching their entire world collapse. They were watching their children drown in their own blood, one by one. They were helpless against a killer they couldn't see and couldn't fight. When science offers no answers, and religion offers no comfort, desperation opens the door to the irrational. They didn't desecrate their dead because they hated them. They did it because they loved the living too much to let them go. Today, you can still visit the grave of Mercy Brown in the Baptist Church Cemetery in Exeter. Her headstone is reinforced with a metal strap because for years, people tried to steal it. Visitors leave coins, flowers, and plastic vampire teeth. It has become a tourist attraction. But if you stand there on a cold March day, when the wind is howling through the trees, you can almost feel the desperation of that morning in 1892, You can feel the weight of a father's grief, heavy enough to break the earth itself. The New England vampires were real. But they weren't the corpses in the coffins. The vampire was the disease. And the horror was the things it made us do to each other in the name of survival. Thank you for joining us on this journey into the dark history of American folklore. If you have a thirst for knowledge and the unknown, make sure to subscribe to Felix Files. We will see you in the shadows next time.